It was not an accident, not an isolated error. And according to what emerges from restricted FBI files, not the story the public has been handed for decades. Janet Jackson, speaking with the gravity of someone who lived inside the storm, confirms that Michael Jackson's death bore the unmistakable markings of a setup, an outcome shaped long before the final night. As a journalist who has spent a lifetime tracing the fault lines beneath celebrity narratives, I can tell you these newly surfaced details fundamentally recalibrate how the world must assess the King of Pop. Classified memos, corroborated timelines, and quiet acknowledgments align with what the family whispered but never dared to state aloud. The pressures unseen, the leverage applied behind closed doors, and the suffocating reality of being boxed in while institutions looked away. Taken together, the evidence forms a stark, unsettling portrait. Before we proceed into what those files reveal and why they were never meant to be public, understand this. What follows has the potential to permanently alter how Michael Jackson's final chapter is understood. Not everyone was able to reconcile with the version of events the public was asked to accept. On one side sat the orderly, impersonal legal conclusion. Case numbers closed, responsibility narrowed, the matter summarized in a few clinical lines. On the other was a family left fractured, carrying absence and an unease that never receded. According to notes and references that surface within FBI files, Janet Jackson occupied the uneasy space between those two realities. She did not raise her voice or issue accusations. Instead, she spoke quietly, with a restraint that only made her words heavier. She could not accept that her brother exited this world in the simplistic manner repeated for years. That refusal to accept the official ending is what gives the story its tension from the opening moment. While the world rushed toward closure, Janet felt the story was only beginning. When news of the death broke, headlines declared that the music had stopped and the lights had gone out. But for Janet, what truly collapsed was something far more intimate: the presence of the brother who once guided her through a relentless childhood. He was never just the King of Pop to her. He was Michael, raised in a household where devotion and pressure were inseparable. FBI timelines show how swiftly conclusions were announced, how efficiently the narrative was sealed. Janet did not challenge it publicly. She remained silent. That silence, the files suggest, was not consent, but disbelief. She later described the sensation as staring at a photograph with a vital piece missing while everyone else insisted it was complete. The speed, the finality, and the timing, just as Michael was being forced into the most unforgiving stretch of his career, made coincidence difficult for her to accept. What troubled Janet most was not only the day everything ended, but the months and years preceding it. The documents outline a man entering the last chapter of his life, physically depleted and emotionally eroded. He slept little, lived under constant strain, and leaned on medical assistance simply to function. Yet Janet saw something deeper than declining health. Her brother carried pressures the public rarely acknowledged: relentless oversight, quiet coercion, and the sense of being maneuvered into a corner. Michael was no longer the celebrated child of the 1980s. He was a black man holding extraordinary cultural and financial power, including ownership stakes and intellectual property that made many uneasy. Janet never framed this as an accusation, but her recollections, echoed subtly in federal records, of cold rooms, tense discussions, and unspoken leverage, painted a clear picture of an industry uncomfortable with losing control. Officially, the story remains focused on a fatal medical failure. But Janet, as reflected in these files, saw a far wider framework. Michael was preparing for a concert run, marketed as a triumphant rebirth, yet privately he was deeply resistant. He told her he was exhausted, frightened by his own physical limits, and overwhelmed by demands that no longer felt negotiable. These were not the laments of a fading star, but the words of someone being carried forward by momentum he no longer commanded. When he died at the precise moment his return promised enormous financial gain, Janet could not ignore the question that haunted her. Who stood to gain the most from his silence? She later admitted that the deepest wound was the sense that her brother had become more asset than human being. In his final years, he was examined, categorized, exploited, and steadily depleted. Janet did not absolve the individual officially blamed, but she viewed that person as only the most visible layer. In her assessment, Michael resembled a piece on a board, positioned to serve many interests. When that piece could no longer move as required, it was removed. This is not a legal judgment found in the files, but the lived conclusion of a sister watching her brother grow increasingly isolated from those who loved him. She observed that his circle of trust shrank, along with his ability to make decisions about his own life, a reality she found more terrifying than any single mistake. Certain details, small and easily dismissed, continue to echo. Michael's repeated remarks that if he were gone, people should not immediately accept the story presented. His constant anxiety about maintaining control over what he had built. At the time, such comments could be written off as stress or pessimism. In hindsight, Janet cannot separate them from what followed. She acknowledges that feelings are not evidence, that suspicion does not equal proof. Yet emotion, unlike law, does not require validation to endure. From that place of unresolved grief, she finally voiced the idea that unsettled the public, that her brother's death was not entirely accidental, that certain conditions had been arranged long before, not as a dramatic conspiracy, but as the cold, methodical outcome of a system trained to value profit above people. Janet does not claim certainty, nor does she seek to persuade. She speaks only as a sister still searching for peace. To her, Michael did not disappear because of a single careless moment. He was worn down over years, steered into circumstances where failure became almost unavoidable. Her pain lies not just in losing him, but in losing him in a way that convinces her everything had been pushed too far, too deliberately, too early. When she reflects on it now, there is no anger in her voice, only exhaustion. Exhaustion from living in a world content with a tidy explanation, while she remains convinced that the truth, like the man himself, was far more complex. LaToya Jackson never expected to become a voice in this narrative. She did not pursue attention, nor did she wish to see her name tethered to the dense rumors orbiting her brother's death. Yet, as any seasoned reporter knows, silence can become a burden heavier than disclosure. According to references embedded in FBI files, LaToya carried that weight for years. When she finally spoke, the tone of the story shifted unmistakably. This was no longer framed as a solitary error or an unfortunate twist of fate. It veered into a colder, more disquieting territory. LaToya was not offering conjecture. She was relaying Michael's own words, statements repeated in private, far from cameras and stage lights. Michael, she said, confided that he felt genuinely endangered. Not the abstract anxiety of a sensitive artist, but a concrete awareness of being monitored and surrounded by people who viewed him primarily as an asset of extraordinary value. FBI notes corroborate her recollection of his demeanor during those conversations. Eyes that no longer reflected the confidence of a global icon, but the alertness of a man who understood he was entangled in forces far larger than himself. Michael told her plainly that if he were ever gone, she should never accept coincidence as an explanation. At the time, those words unsettled LaToya without fully revealing their meaning. Only after everything was concluded did their weight become unmistakable. At the center of Michael's warnings, LaToya emphasized, was ownership, specifically his music catalog. Not performance, not celebrity, but the copyrights accumulated through decades of work. Those assets represented true leverage, the rare ability to operate without deference. Michael understood precisely what he held, and he understood how many interests were fixed upon it. He told her, without hysteria, that they did not need him. They needed what he owned. He named no individuals, but he consistently pointed upward, toward levels of power where money and influence quietly dictate outcomes. The tone, LaToya insisted, was not paranoid, but analytical. During that period, Michael was preparing for a major performance venture while suffering visible physical and emotional depletion. LaToya observed his weight loss, the constant strain, and his admission that control over his own schedule and decisions had eroded. What frightened her most was not his exhaustion, but his sense of inevitability, as though events were being advanced step by step toward a conclusion already written. He spoke less about long-term plans and more about contingencies, including what should happen if he were suddenly gone. She later recalled Michael's repeated references to isolation. Long-standing confidants faded from view, replaced by impeccably professional figures who felt distant and transactional. He confided that he no longer knew whom to trust. Having navigated the industry since childhood, Michael understood its rewards and its ruthlessness. He had risen, dominated, and refused submission, and paid for that independence. LaToya believed it was precisely this refusal to yield that rendered him inconvenient. In a system accustomed to control, a man who owns too much and resists direction becomes a liability. Some details LaToya shared only in near whispers. Michael's frequent reminders to look after his children if anything happened. His insistence that public narratives often concealed more than they revealed. These were not theatrical premonitions, but measured preparations from someone sensing an unseen barrier drawing closer. She tried to reassure him, suggesting he was imagining too much. Michael, she said, simply shook his head and repeated that matters had gone too far. When his death occurred, LaToya's reaction was not shock in the conventional sense. Grief was immediate and overwhelming, but it was accompanied by a stark recognition. The warnings had materialized. That realization compelled her to speak. She feared that if responsibility were reduced to a single individual's error, everything Michael had cautioned her about would vanish with him. She does not claim evidence nor comprehensive knowledge. She asserts only that Michael sensed danger, articulated it clearly, and acted accordingly. For her, that alone makes a simplified explanation insufficient. Public response was swift and divided when LaToya spoke. Some dismissed her as grief-stricken, others accused her of invention. Yet many began to reassess long-familiar facts. They recalled Michael's public confrontations with the industry, the prolonged disputes with powerful corporations, and the reality that he was not merely an artist, but the owner of assets, coveted at the highest levels. LaToya does not seek validation. By placing her account on record, the narrative can no longer return untouched to its original form. What gives this chapter its gravity is not whether every assertion can be proven, but that it resonates with a broader fear, the vulnerability of those who stand too tall and control too much in environments that resist independence. In LaToya's view, Michael did not die as a random casualty. He died as a man who understood he was walking along a perilous edge. From those warnings, documented and remembered, the picture begins to shift, gradually but irreversibly. Paris Jackson was raised between two irreconcilable realities. In one, her father existed as an untouchable figure, a name capable of igniting stadiums with a single appearance. In the other, far from the public gaze, Michael Jackson was a fragile, sleepless parent, often sitting alone long after the house had gone quiet. It is this private world, echoed in fragments across FBI summaries and family interviews, that shaped Paris's understanding. When she eventually spoke, it was not with drama or spectacle, but with the steady resolve of someone who had carried a truth too heavy to remain unspoken. Paris recalls her father's final days with unsettling clarity. The atmosphere inside the home bore no resemblance to the triumphant return the public anticipated. There was no excitement, no sense of completion, only a constant, low-grade tension that seemed to seep into every room. Michael was frequently cold despite mild weather, visibly anxious, easily startled, and prone to unexplained tears. Paris was still young, yet perceptive enough to recognize that this was not ordinary exhaustion. It felt to her like a man being driven beyond his limits, fully aware that something was terribly wrong. Michael rarely explained the pressures directly to his children, but his emotional state required no translation. Paris saw it in the prolonged silences, in the way simple questions went unanswered. Some nights he would sit beside her bed, gently brushing her hair, tears quietly falling. These moments were not born of fear of the public, but of a deeper apprehension, an awareness perhaps of something unavoidable drawing closer. For Paris, those memories never faded. They became the lens through which she would later reassess everything. When Paris eventually spoke publicly, many were caught off guard. The world expected a sheltered daughter, not a voice marked by precision and restraint. Yet she spoke plainly, without accusation or embellishment. All arrows point to that. It was a setup. The words were delivered without heat, sounding less like an allegation than a conclusion reached after years of observation. She named no individuals, offered no theories, only the assertion that what unfolded around her father was not random, a belief formed by witnessing daily life inside that house. Reaction was immediate and divided. Some dismissed her words as grief refracted through loss. Others paused, recognizing that such convictions are rarely born in isolation. Paris did not reference documents or procedures. She spoke of her father's fear, his growing withdrawal, and his diminishing trust in those around him. These details may not appear in official findings, but they existed vividly in the lived experience of a child who watched them unfold. The weight of Paris's account is amplified by its alignment with other family voices. Her perspective intersects with LaToya's recollections and Janet's long-held doubts, different ages, different vantage points, converging on the same conclusion. Michael did not leave this world in peace. Paris believes her father was steadily worn down, not only physically, but by an environment that denied him vulnerability. An environment where a powerful black man was perpetually scrutinized, and where real authority resided not on stage, but behind closed doors. Paris has said her father taught his children to believe in love and goodness, even as he himself absorbed relentless judgment. To her, Michael lived in contradiction, adored globally, yet constantly doubted. That tension, she believes, pushed him into profound isolation. When a person is elevated to icon status and denied the right to fail, every pressure intensifies. Paris believes this made her father uniquely exposed and easier to maneuver within a system she could only partially see. There are details she recounts sparingly, yet they linger. Michael's repeated sense of insecurity, even at home. His insistence that his children always be careful without naming a threat. Paris does not call these premonitions. She calls them instinct, honed by years of upheaval. When events ultimately aligned with those fears, she found it impossible to accept coincidence. After her father's death, Paris endured a period of profound darkness. It was during that time, she says, that clarity emerged. She does not ask to be believed. She only maintains that the official account fails to reflect what she witnessed. For her, truth is not about assigning guilt, but about acknowledging perspectives left unrecorded. A daughter stating that her father was placed in an unfair, irreversible position is, in itself, a tragedy. Paris's words do not close the case. They deepen it. They redirect attention from polished narratives to the human reality beneath them. In her account, Michael Jackson is not an invulnerable legend, but a weary father, fearful, perceptive, and conscious of the tightening pressure around him. That perspective is difficult to dismiss precisely because it demands engagement, forcing listeners to confront the enduring, deeply human grief carried by those who knew him best. Once the focus shifts beyond the family and into the wider machinery surrounding Michael Jackson, the weight of the story changes. It is no longer confined to the private sorrow of Janet, LaToya, or Paris, but expands into something broader and more foreboding. Michael did not merely live within the walls of his home, he existed inside a powerful system. FBI reference timelines and contextual notes suggest a structure that elevated him to unprecedented heights, while simultaneously becoming the source of his greatest resistance in his final years. This is where the central tension sharpens. Michael had ceased to be their artist. He had become too autonomous, too resistant to direction, while controlling assets many desired, yet could not access. Accounts from those around him, though never formalized, consistently describe an atmosphere of constant strain. Meetings bled into one another, schedules tightened, and decisions were executed at a pace that left little room for reflection. Michael, once meticulous and authoritative over every aspect of his career, watched that control gradually slip away. He remained under the lights, but the levers behind the curtain were increasingly operated by others. Janet sensed this shift immediately. She recalls that her brother no longer spoke about music with enthusiasm. His conversations were dominated by contracts, obligations, and arrangements he could not untangle despite repeated attempts. One overlooked moment stands out in hindsight. Michael publicly criticized leaders within the industry he had served for decades, choosing words that were direct and unfiltered. For someone long positioned as a favored figure within that system, such defiance amounted to stepping beyond its protection. Janet understood the implications instantly. From that point on, her brother was no longer met with warmth. In an environment where control and image outweigh empathy, a black man openly challenging his treatment was bound to provoke discomfort. Nothing was stated outright, yet the shift was unmistakable. Cooler interactions, greater distance, and pressures that no longer bothered to hide. This was followed by a noticeable transformation in Michael's inner circle. Trusted figures who had stood beside him for years quietly faded away, replaced by professionals focused on efficiency, optics, and outcomes. Janet does not frame these newcomers as villains, but she observed her brother becoming increasingly isolated. His freedom narrowed. Every decision passed through layers of approval. Every reassurance came wrapped in the phrase, "This is for your benefit." Janet says that phrase drained Michael more than anything else because his interests no longer seemed aligned with those managing his life. After Michael's death, the aftermath only deepened Janet's unease. His music saturated the airwaves, merchandise surged, and revenues soared. From a business perspective, it was seamless. From a sister's perspective, it was chilling. Michael was everywhere, yet no one asked whether he had been exhausted, whether he had been overwhelmed. The machinery continued to operate with remarkable efficiency. That continuity convinced Janet that he had been absorbed into a system that, once in motion, did not stop when the central figure disappeared. Janet does not claim the industry alone orchestrated everything. She maintains only that Michael did not leave in isolation. He departed amid unresolved conflicts and competing interests. Reducing the explanation to a single individual, she believes, makes the story easier to digest but erases the prolonged pressures that bore down on him for years. In her view, Michael was forced into an impossibly fragile position, expected to deliver on colossal demands while safeguarding what he owned, without the reserves left to resist. Critics argue that Janet's perspective is shaped by emotion. Yet it is precisely that emotion that allows her to perceive dimensions official accounts cannot capture. She recalls her final extended conversation with Michael with striking clarity. He spoke no longer of aspirations or distant plans, but of fatigue, of longing for quiet, of feeling compressed from every direction. His voice, she says, was subdued, as if he feared being overheard. In that moment, Janet became convinced he understood he was no longer safe, even if he could not articulate why. This chapter unsettles many because it offers no singular antagonist, no sensational revelation to neatly resolve the story. Instead, it presents a convergence of pressures, decisions made quietly, and a man gradually worn down. That ambiguity is what makes it most disturbing. When responsibility is diffused across layers, no one bears full blame, yet no one emerges untainted. Janet Jackson does not step forward as an accuser. She steps forward as a witness to what surrounded her brother. To her, Michael was not taken in a single instant. He was exhausted by years of friction with a system unused to being challenged. When she suggests that events were, in effect, prearranged, it is not a legal assertion, but the weary conclusion of someone who has seen too many inconsistencies to ignore. The story thus transcends personal loss, becoming an examination of how an icon can be drawn into a vortex of power, profit, and silence, and never find a way out. The final chapter of this story does not arrive with noise, nor does it offer a dramatic resolution that neatly ties every loose end. Instead, it settles uncomfortably, like a dull ache that has lingered too long to cry out. Janet Jackson never positioned herself as an arbiter of truth. She did not step forward to accuse, nor did she attempt to assign blame. What she has done, according to reflections echoed in FBI-style summaries of family testimony, is far more restrained. She held her emotions in silence until the weight of them became unbearable, until speaking felt like the only way to breathe. Janet has said that the deepest pain was not the public's acceptance of the official account, but the speed with which people sought closure. When an icon of Michael Jackson's magnitude disappears, the world craves a clean explanation, something that allows the music to continue playing without discomfort. To Janet, that cleanliness feels like erasure. It dismisses what she witnessed firsthand: years of exhaustion, unspoken fear, and a brother who was increasingly denied the freedom to simply exist as himself. She recalls lying awake at night, not searching for a villain, but wondering why Michael felt so alone, despite never being physically alone. She remembers the moment when the finality truly set in. It was not when headlines erupted, but when she saw Michael's image reduced to a finished commodity. His catalog, his influence, his financial impact recited with effortless precision. Everything was accounted for except the human cost. To Janet, that omission was devastating. Even in death, Michael seemed stripped of vulnerability. That realization hardened her belief that his passing could not be explained by a single, convenient narrative. Much of what Janet communicates is not spoken aloud. In rare conversations about her brother, she pauses frequently, as though measuring each memory before allowing it to surface. She does not offer sensational anecdotes. She recounts lived moments. A brother who shielded her from the crushing weight of family expectations, who became her anchor when they were both too young to understand how unforgiving the world could be. She speaks of Michael carrying a burden that required him to be perpetually stronger than necessary, aware that failure was not an option. As a black man occupying immense power within a rigid industry, his margin for error was vanishingly small. Janet does not state this directly, but it is woven into every recollection. When Janet says events felt prearranged, many anticipate a revelation of conspiracy. What they encounter instead is far more unsettling. There is no cinematic plot, no singular mastermind. There is only a sequence of circumstances, pressures layered upon pressures, decisions accumulating quietly until retreat was no longer possible. She believes Michael was pushed into a position so fragile that even a minor disruption could bring everything down. Not because he lacked strength, but because the load placed upon him had become unsustainable. To Janet, this is the hardest truth to accept. Her brother did not collapse in an instant. He was gradually worn away. The story concludes here, not because clarity has been achieved, but because Janet has reached the limit of what she can articulate. She does not ask for belief. She asks only for reflection, for a moment in which Michael is seen not as an untouchable legend, but as a human being who carried an impossible weight. For her, speaking now is not about reopening wounds, but about preventing her brother from being reduced to a sterile summary. Michael Jackson, in Janet's mind, is not a closed case. He is an unresolved ache, a reminder that truth does not always reside in the most widely accepted explanation, but often in the grief that was never given room to speak. That is why this account offers no satisfaction. It ends with heaviness, the kind that invites silence rather than applause. Janet Jackson proposes no remedy. She leaves behind only an uncomfortable recognition, the sense that a man left this world under circumstances that were not just and that the world moved on too quickly. As long as that feeling endures, she believes Michael's story cannot truly be finished, no matter how long ago it was closed on paper. When all fragments are examined side by side, the story of Michael Jackson no longer reads like a closed case, but like an open wound that continues to throb in the collective consciousness. What unsettles is not what authorities finalized, but what was never fully voiced. Janet, LaToya, and Paris do not present evidence designed to rewrite legal history. Instead, as reflected in the tone and subtext of FBI-style summaries of family accounts, they offer something harder to dismiss: the lived impressions of those who stood closest to Michael, who saw his exhaustion deepen, who sensed the pressures tightening, and who heard concerns that never found their way into official statements. At times, it is precisely this emotional proximity that makes the truth feel more disturbing than any document. Throughout his life, Michael Jackson existed between two extremes: intensely adored and relentlessly examined. He occupied a summit few have reached, yet stood there without protection. A black man wielding extraordinary global influence, commanding immense artistic and economic power while being afforded no room for fragility. From the family's vantage point, his death was not an isolated incident, but the endpoint of years of accumulated strain. Decisions increasingly made around him rather than by him, within a system resistant to defiance and uncomfortable with autonomy. This account does not insist on belief in any single explanation. It asks only for pause, to see Michael as a human being before an icon, to recognize Janet's anguish as she confronts how swiftly the world sealed a chapter that, to her, remains painfully unresolved. To hear LaToya revisiting warnings once brushed aside, to understand Paris as a daughter shaped by memories of a father who never truly found peace. These perspectives do not contradict the law. They supplement it with a dimension paperwork cannot contain. Perhaps the full truth will never be known. Yet listening carefully, extending empathy, and resisting the urge for immediate closure may be the most honest way to honor a life that bore too much weight. Michael Jackson's legacy deserves remembrance not only through sound and spectacle, but through compassion for the wounds he carried to the end. If this account resonates, consider engaging with it, sharing a more humane perspective of Michael Jackson. Leave a comment with your reflections, because every feeling adds context. And subscribe to continue examining the stories behind the spotlight, where truth often resides not only in what was recorded, but in what had to be endured in silence.
Thanks so much for sticking with us to the very end. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like and hit that subscribe button so you won't miss any of our daily updates. Now feel free to check out some of our latest and most popular videos showing up on your screen. Goodbye, and see you in the next one.